slightly different webinar experience we're having today for the CMS In Touch, because we're actually using webinar meetings rather than our webinar usual format in Zoom. And the reason for this is that we're hoping that we're going to have some breakout activities. I'm just about to pass over to Noortje, who's going to introduce the webinar. But what I would ask you to do, as you were reminded in the email that you received via Eventbrite, is that we're going to be using Canva today. Which is an online program. Now, some of you might have a Canva account. If you don't have a Canva account, you can sign up for it here. And what we're going to do, as Noor is introducing the webinar, we're going to put up a question, and we would like you to join us on our Canva post, and we want you to write how you're feeling at the moment about that question. So here's the link that you need. If there's any questions throughout the webinar, you can just direct message me on the chat function. And likewise, what we're going to do is have some fantastic speakers, then a breakout session where you can have some discussion and chats, and then coming back for a Q&A. So this might work, or it might completely fall to pieces, but you know, that's the fun of doing things with CMS In Touch. So in the meantime, I'm going to hand over to Noortje, and welcome everyone. Please continue to put your hellos on the chat as we go along. Thanks, Noortje.
Hi, everyone. I'm Noortje from Amsterdam. I'm with Utrecht School of Governance, and I'm really happy that so many of you are joining us here today in this webinar. As Kat just said, I will do a brief introduction on the topic, which is embodied knowing in management and organizations. So when I think of embodied knowing, I think how we as people come to know the world through our bodies and how our bodies enable us to act in the world. Knowing is a full-bodied experience, and research is too. But we need the concept of embodied knowing because the dominant paradigm doesn't do justice to this reality. It favors objective facts and disembodied knowledge, and disregards or rejects the embodied aspects of knowing. Therefore, we use the concept embodied knowing to ask, how can we enrich our academic practices by attending to the senses, to bodily movement and comportment, and to effective circulations? So when we're talking about embodied knowing, we're talking also about tacit knowledge and knowing from your gut. These are all different modalities of knowing that are intimately woven into how we think, act, and organize work. Embodied knowing can thus strengthen our capacity to understand and intervene in the politics of organizational life. But there are also challenges to using embodied knowing, and I want to mention two of them today to sort of contextualize what we're talking about. The first is the rise of post-truth politics. With the resurgence of right-wing populism, together with algorithms that online media use, we've seen over the past decade a spread of alternative facts and conspiracy theories that contest evidence, expertise, and scholarship. So this has led to polarization, violence, and increased discrimination, and to crisis in scholarship. And the answer of many academics has been to highlight objectively observable facts and disembodied reason, to stress the factuality and thereby the legitimacy of our work. But reestablishing the dominance of this particular form of academic knowledge has also created doubt around and attacks on the kind of embodied knowledge we're talking about today, and the critical thinking that informs this. So globally, we see a defunding and dismantling of the humanities, gender studies, and critical race studies in particular, and other critical programs. And I think the recent layoffs of critical management scholars at Leicester University are a case in point. Yet we need the critical thinking that these programs teach, and I think the concept of embodied knowledge within this critical thinking, because they're crucial for understanding the lived realities of workers, for disrupting the systemic power structures that shape their experiences, and for attending to the challenges that this political climate puts forth. The pandemic is the second challenge to embodied knowing, and the one that we're going to be talking about most today. Everyone is dealing with the impact of the pandemic, but there are major differences in how people are affected. The pandemic amplifies existing inequalities, as you probably already know. Black and minority ethnic populations, for example, are more severely affected in terms of health outcomes and job opportunities. Those in precarious work condition, low-wage laborers, and people on contemporary contracts have lost their jobs and have become even more precarious. And the gender gap is also widening. Many women have seen an exponential growth in their care duties and are increasingly struggling to combine work with private life, some even leaving the labor market. And all of this plays out a bit differently in the global north and the global south. So overall, you could say that the pandemic has caused radical changes in how work is organized. But COVID-19 impacts not only what we study, but also how we study organizational realities. And I will briefly go into both here. So about the what, there are many contemporary topics of interest that are highlighted by the pandemic. When I was preparing for this talk, I was remembering the video that went viral last week, and probably many of you have seen it. It's the lawyer who was in the Zoom meeting with two judges. It seemed like an important meeting, but the lawyer was trapped in this cat filter. And on the video, you see the cat's eyes going back and forth insecurely. And you hear the lawyer's voice saying, "I am here. I am not a cat. I just can't get this filter off." And I think this perfectly illustrates how the embodiment of people who work online, and that's many of us nowadays, is fundamentally entangled with technology and bodies and things that populate the home. Working from home has also increased work-related injuries, pain and stress because we're less mobile in our work. And the question you can ask are many, but also what inequalities are produced through all these changes. But obviously there are also people who can't work from home, those we nowadays refer to as essential workers or frontline workers. And I'm thinking of supermarket employees, cleaners, healthcare professionals and teachers, for example. Their embodiment is shaped by ideas about contamination, rules for social distancing, walking routes, mouth mask requirements, hand sanitizer, and what employers do and do not offer in terms of risk management. These workers are hit hardest and have become ever more precarious. So these are just a few topics of interest that you can think of, and there are many, many more. Also of interest is the impact of COVID-19 on how we research embodiment in management and organizations. What are methodological challenges and opportunities for attending to embodied knowing? How do we attend to the senses, to touch, to taste, to smell, for example, when doing research online? And how can we, under current circumstances, multiply our repertoires of knowledge production to include the moods, atmosphere, bodily comportment, facial expressions, the sensory and the sensuous? In short, all of the things we come to know through our bodies. And how do we envision the future? What are the existing methodologies that we can use to attend to embodied knowledge? And do we have to adapt them? Are there new ways forward, new methodologies even? Our speakers will address some of these questions today, and we would very much like to invite you into the conversation in the breakout sessions after the speakers, as Kat already mentioned. So now I will turn over to our speakers, which will first be Alia Weston, then Louise Wallenberg, and then Rafael Alcadipani. I hope I have pronounced your names correctly. So Alia, on to you.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to meet you virtually. I'm going to be sharing some slides with my screen, so I'm just going to put them up. Okay, it's live. Okay, so hi, I'm Alia Weston. I am an associate professor of creative and business enterprise. I teach and I live in Canada usually. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe. You can see that I'm not in Canada right now. I'm in Zimbabwe for personal, for family reasons. And so I'll be talking about my experience of being I guess I'll say I'm an embodied scholar. All of my work kind of situates around the philosophy of empowering social change through creative enterprise. So I bring these different kinds of threads together through different work that I've done before. So I'm a critical management scholar, but I'm also a jewelry designer. And so I bring all of these things together. And at OCAS University in Toronto, I teach art and design students about business. So very situated in an embodied practice. I was really thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, given how we're thinking about what does it mean to be embodied in a world where we have a pandemic going on, where we're fearing for our safety, where we're all online, we're virtual, and that's very impersonal. But I think, over the trajectory, I've kind of been learning that there are still some very personal and connected things through these disconnected experiences. So I wanted to talk about 3 examples of experiences that I faced over the last year. And so one of these is about my experiences with ending embodied practices in a way, because I couldn't do some of my work. Early on, I had a bit of an existential crisis because I do a lot of practice-based applied research, and I couldn't do any of it anymore, and I didn't know what to do with myself. Then I'll talk about another example through a lens that I'm calling mending. There are some projects that I'm working on where some of them I had to stop doing altogether, and others we carried on in different formats online. And then the final one, which I'm calling sending, and that is centered on my creative practice as a doula, and working on that in different kinds of ways. But before I do that, I wanted to share that I've been doing a lot of thinking this last year about how I've been doing my work and why I've been doing it in the ways that I've been doing it. And so I wanted to share these thoughts from one of my favorite authors, Bell Hooks, in her book, All About Love, New Visions. And she talks about this idea that genuine love is based on ideas of care, commitment, trust, knowledge, responsibility, respect, openness, honesty, communication, and another thought that there can be no love without justice. And I keep coming back to this year because as the pandemic kind of exploded just about a year ago, when we were trying to figure out, what do we do with our lives? How do we work in a university? I was an associate dean, and so I was working with the leadership in our university to kind of get everything all online. And it struck me, how do we do this? And I kept coming back to Bell Hooks' thoughts about love, right? That whatever I did I wanted it to come through a place of care, community responsibility, community safety, and love, because I really couldn't think about any other way that we could get through what was happening, where we were all scared and just nobody knew what to do. And it's really interesting because this has been coming back to me through all of my work as it's woven throughout and as it's evolved and changed over time. And these things of love, care, and community coming together in different kinds of ways has been really important to me. So the example that I wanted to talk about with ending, so just before, on the cusp of when the pandemic happened, I was working on a project about creative women's entrepreneurship. So we were working with a group of women-identified creatives, and we held a series of dinners. And I have this method that I developed. It's I use food as an arts-based method, and we gathered creative women to come together, and we held these dinners. We interacted, we talked about ideas, we wrote ideas down on tablecloths to collect our data, doing it in a really embodied way, right? How do you translate ideas through food? How do you connect people to come together, to share, to learn, to grow together? Kind of an intergenerational mentoring kind of experience over food, and part of a research project. And we had our last dinner in the series just a couple of days before our university closed. And so that was kind of, I think, a really poignant kind of ending to this project, that we were able to do the in-person parts of the project. But then we got to thinking, well, what do we do now? We're doing interviews, we're carrying, kind of catching up with people, reflecting on the project. And we had to completely change everything because we realized that if we look through a lens of care and love, people have completely different priorities. So how we ended up doing the interviews, we ended up doing many fewer interviews. We spoke with people who wanted to speak with us, who felt enriched by having these conversations, and we left the rest of the project to kind of, as it, it went as it may, because that was just the nature of it. And we have a report that we wrote about this, about critical perspectives on women's entrepreneurship, about these, this experiences of what does it mean to create with a group together like this? And so that was a really interesting experience because it ended up being extremely embodied to extremely disembodied. And the most connection I had in that project ended up being with my research collaborators and research assistants. And we kept coming together every week. And my researcher, one of the assistants said, you know, this is the thing that I wait for every week, that we come together and we talk. And we actually just talked about our lives. And made sure everybody was safe and well before we went on to do our work. And that became a really important part of our practice. So rather than being together in person, we ended up sharing that care online and translating that in different ways. And so our work, it kind of evolved in a different kind of embodied way, but still had these aspects of care and love and connection. And had another couple of projects, which one of them completely didn't work. So I had gotten funding to do a project with a group of women in Zimbabwe. So it's near where I live, and we were going to work together on a co-design project to develop an initiative around menstrual health management and developing products for women and creating a social enterprise around that. So it was partly a research project and partly a very kind of embodied project where we're actually going to be creating projects together and working out a format to sell them and actually creating a living, breathing social enterprise in the community. And that project completely had to end. And I wanted to start with this idea of mending because my idea was, how do you, you know, everything's been so kind of like broken in this moment of, you know, how do we work together when there's a health crisis? And early on, we decided with my research collaborators in the community that we actually couldn't do the project anymore. And we have to put it on hold until the pandemic ends because safety is far more important. Safety of the community is far important. But one of the interesting things that happened is the picture on the left of the screen is this is a tap. So one of the things that became really important in the community, that there was this shared tap for everybody to use that became unsafe because nobody could like touch it together. And so it became a kind of an activity in me in Toronto, community members here in Zimbabwe, another collaborator, all working together online and just sharing ideas and expertise together to figure out a way that the tap could be shared safely. So in a sense, this project about one thing ended up being about something completely different, about healthy, safe, clean drinking water and how that water tap could be shared in that community. On the right-hand side of the screen, I've been working on another project. This is also about a social enterprise. So I'm currently teaching with a group that's called Stitch Lab, where they're building a social enterprise for women to, they're like doing sewing and creating sewing products. And those are going to be sold and it's going to be a social enterprise. And that had to be shifted, but because we were in the global north, we've been able to do that online. So I've currently been in Zimbabwe in the global south, and I'm teaching to a group of women, teaching ideas about social enterprise, and we're all online. And it's really interesting because we all had to figure out how to do this in a really different way, and what it means to actually do a practical project in a virtual way. And so I shared just these two different examples as a contrast of this idea: how do you mend something that's been fractured by, you know, all of the different challenges that have been happening in the world, and still create a semblance of community care and, you know, carrying on in whatever way was meaningful for everybody. And then the last example I wanted to share is actually my creative practice. And I explained at the beginning that I had this existential crisis, and this was back in maybe April, because I had a sabbatical and I had all these plans, you know, coming to Zimbabwe to work on the social enterprise, traveling, and absolutely none of it could happen. I then decided to start doing some other projects. So I started getting involved. I have some work around creativity and crisis. And I started working on that, and none of that worked either. Just everywhere I went to and whatever I tried to do, it just would not work and it would not go anywhere. And I realized it was just because, you know, nobody was able to do these things. Like whatever presence was needed, or health and care, or safety, or ethics, you know, so many different kinds of decisions were coming into play that were leading to my decisions to either actively stop doing projects, or where a project just didn't go somewhere because you know, nobody in our teams had the capacity to carry on with the work. And so I just let it go. I was like, okay, whatever happens this year, happens this year. And I will do interesting things. And so I wanted to share some of the things I've been doing. So as a professor who teaches at this intersection of a very practical subject, so business, but I'm a critical management scholar. So I bring that together as a scholar and a practitioner. And I work around social change, and I teach my students about social enterprise and social change. How do we create actual businesses? You know, thinking about what meaningful principles we want to convey in these businesses actively, and actually put them out into the world. I have 2 jewelry businesses, and I've put this idea here around sending because I've had to completely shift everything that I'm doing from some very embodied practices where I actually make things with my hands and I meet people and you wear jewelry. It's actually like a very physical thing. I'm now having to do my businesses completely online, and it's been very different for me. I had really no idea what I was doing online because I'm not an online like management expert. So, you know, I love doing things in person. So but what I've been doing is coming back to those themes of community care that I mentioned at the beginning from hooks, and thinking, well, how can I infuse or just, you know, bring out these threads even more in my businesses to create that care, even if it is through the medium of an online format or an item of jewelry being sent over the post. And so on the left-hand side of the screen, my one practice is called Firefly's Atelier. I make gemstone jewelry with principles of sustainability. So you'll see at the bottom, these are some sapphire earrings, and the stones have been come from Tanzania, so I'm African, and I'm really interested in sourcing gems fair trade from places that are from the part of the world where I'm from. And then in the top picture, that is some handmade paper. So all of my like practices that I do in the studio with this work are all around recycling and repurposing, but doing it in really beautiful and caring ways. So caring about the planet and about people. And when it's safe to do so, I'm going to be doing some tree planting. So every order that is made in that business, we plant a tree for school children in the same community that I'm working with for the social enterprise. So when that's safe, we're going to be doing that. And so there are still some embodied things that that are there, that are waiting to happen, but it's kind of it's still flowing, like thinking about, you know, what does love and care for the community and for the environment mean in these contexts. And then on the right-hand side, this is the another business of mine. It's under my name, so Alia Weston Jewelry, and I make lace jewelry that's based on a technique that's inspired by my heritage. So I'm a person of color, and I have a mixed heritage, British, South African, and lace making is something that's a very traditional technique in the cultures that I'm from, but I brought it into a contemporary technique, but around ideas that, you know, we can really be surrounded by beauty, we can take care of ourselves, and it can be nurturing and powerful, but it can also say a lot about heritage. So I'm really big on cultural respect and authentic design. And my work is about pushing back on cultural appropriation and disrespectful and colonial practices in business. And so I bring that out in a physical product. And I've had to kind of like really think about how, you know, what it means to take care and make products, you know, in a virtual sense. And still the teaching is part of this business as well. So I do teach and I mentor. And how that still carries on in caring and loving ways that I can still like share like what I do, both in terms of work and in terms of how I get to connect. Like I'm doing some mentoring at the moment, so like virtually across the world for other creative entrepreneurs. And yeah, so I wanted to share these examples because I found it very interesting for myself to reflect on like what did work and what didn't work over this year, but to kind of just come back to these points that I've been working through. So I want to leave with this quote from Hooks, which is, the light of love is always in us, and coming back to those principles of community care and compassion and love. And, you know, what is it for me? This is like resonates so much with how I've been doing my work and how I've been able for myself to sustain myself in the pandemic, but also bring that through all of the work that I've been doing. And it's the work that I've been, you know, caring for these ways that's really blossomed and been doing some interesting and beautiful things over this past year. So that's what I wanted to share with all of you, my perspective on embodiment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alia. I'm not sure if I was supposed to be chairing and introducing the next speaker, but wonderful. I'm sure we'll be able to, and many people will be wanting to revisit many of the things that you brought up in your wonderful talk. Okay, now I'll hand over to Louise, who'll be speaking on a rather different topic. Louise, you've been, one of the things that you were going to talk to us about had to do with your experiences with interviewing celebrities before the ongoing corona pandemic. I'm sure you might have something else in store for us as well, but anyway.
Yeah, actually it's going to be one interview that I'm going to focus on. So this was pre-COVID. And it was an interview that went wrong and that affected me in ways that have made it impossible for me to actually use the material in my research. And I still come back to this interview in my mind over and over, and I try to hush it away because it fills me with still such shame and a sense of failure. And I keep it on my laptop, but I have not dared to listen to it, nor have I had it transcribed. So it is hidden, and it has been hidden, but now I've been sort of pushed by Torkild to talk about it, so I will. But first, some background information. Since 2018, I've been involved in a research project entitled Representing Women, dealing with women's experiences from working in the Swedish film industry in different positions, above the line and below the line positions. And this project is interdisciplinary, combining perspectives from film studies, gender studies, political science, and law. And it departs from the notion that film, but also television, is a very powerful and important cultural expression. Films mirror and mold our understandings of society and contribute to public debate. And they inform us about social groupings and about who is or is not in power. The question then of who is permitted to make films and what messages are communicated are very important. And here the very long dominance of men in film as directors and producers foremostly, and the traditional representations of gender relations on screen are highly problematic. If men dictate the industry, and the image is produced, whose reality is then being represented? And it is clear that the political, organizational, and legal framework shaping film production and distribution is impeding women's access to the industry and to representation. In order to capture the different dimensions of gender informing Swedish film and Swedish film culture, the project advances from an understanding of film and filmmaking as a system of representations. And in feminist film studies and theory, representation usually refers to how women are portrayed in film. However, representation can also be understood in terms of women's presence in the industry, in the workplace, and also in terms of how and which films by women are being screened, available to the public, to the larger public. Previous studies on gender equality in the film industry have contributed with different kinds of quantitative measures of the number of women in different positions, as well as differences between women and men regarding budget size, ticket sales, quality of networks, etc. And other studies have focused on impediments to gender equality, such as conflicts with women's care work and the dominance of men in decision-making positions. However, there is little known about how gender equality measures actually affect women's experience in everyday experiences in the industry. And this is why we decided to do semi-structured, in-depth interviews with women film workers, investigating how they experience the day-to-day practice in an industry where gender equality, like the Swedish one, has been promoted for the past 20 years. So we're interested in knowing what institutional arrangements give rise to opportunities, but also problems, and in what way women's experiences give rise to counter strategies and resistances. The interviews were carried out in 2018 and 2019 before the pandemic, and they were carried out in person at my office, at the participants' offices, or sometimes at their private homes. The participants were of different ages, ranging from 26 to 86, and the interviews lasted between 50 minutes and 3 hours. The older women have been the most difficult to interview. Their long and varied experience led to a certain flexibility in time. This happened in 1963. No, 68, or was it 73? No, it was 83, right? Yet their memory about who was involved and where and how was often amazingly clear, I must say. Also, talking about gender with the somewhat older informants was quite difficult, because they did not want to discuss gender as a problem, whereas the younger ones were very eager to talk about it. So there was a very clear differences between the two age groups. The interviews were carried out together with a colleague, and I found it very helpful to be two people in this situation. Yet I always came out of the interviews thinking that we could have gotten more out of the interviews. And I think actually that being two people may restrict and hamper the participant in telling her story. Although many of them had hard times being met with belittling comments, sexual advances, and many kinds of resistance from co-workers, and being counteracted and not getting the final support that they had been promised at first, the discussion was always very sober. No big emotions. Facts were put on the table, often with a sigh and a shrug. This is the way it is. It's shit, but there's nothing I can do about it. And then there is this one interview that I carried out myself without my colleague. We met her in her office in a fancy building in the city center of a big city located in a large and conflicted country that is not Sweden. She's an internationally famous actress and filmmaker, and I have actually grown up with her face and her voice. And my first encounter with her was probably when I was 4 years old, and she appeared in a television series as the main protagonist. Over the years, I have taught her films to both fashion, gender, and film students, and I feel I know her work. I have even been to one of the houses where she once lived, and I have seen the very private love calendar that she kept together with her husband at the time. So it's almost as if I know her, right? So this interview starts out well, but I remember coming there being very sort of nervous and excited, because I must admit that I was definitely starstruck, right? But it starts out well, and we talk about her acting experiences and about what it has been like to be directed by men for the most of the times that she has been acting. Here, everything is smooth. It's a story without any real setbacks. Well, maybe one or two, but she can laugh at them in retrospect. Then we move over to her directing experiences, which initially were very positive. As she brings up her last engagement as director, the story takes another turn, as does the interview. She's very, very honest, and I'm a bit surprised, all while thinking that I must be doing very well and that my interview skills must be great. No one of the other 25 women we have interviewed have been this open about their struggles. but her story soon turns into a story of complete humiliation, of harassment, and of exclusion. And as she tells me, tears fill her eyes. And soon they are falling down her cheeks, and her voice changes as she tries to express herself through them and through the revisiting to this humiliation. Yeah. And she is so vulnerable and so naked. And I remember hearing another participant's words in my ears, who is a former colleague, but also a friend of this woman. She told me that this person, she is without skin. So there's nothing that can actually help her guard herself, right? And this is also what I'm experiencing in this situation. And emotionally, this is very difficult for me, and I cannot help but getting affected, very affected. I feel my own tears coming, my nose starts to run, my stomach contracts, and my knees begin to shake, and it's difficult for me to breathe. All I want to do is to get up, walk over to her, and hug her, or just to get out of there, because by now I know that this is not going to end in a good way, but I don't. That would be unprofessional, and it would be unethical, both the hugging and the fleeing. Soon the interview has transformed into a scenario with me as counseling part, as someone who tries to be a good friend, or really a bad therapist. It is obvious that my emotional response is just making everything worse for her. And as we end the interview, we do hug. She stretches out her arms and she hugs me, and I let her do this. I leave her and her office on shaky legs and with a burning feeling of total failure and emptiness. She had given me the most valuable material one could hope for. She has shared with me her pain and her largest professional failure in an honest and very sincere way, but it's all wrong, and I cannot use the material because of my failure as an interviewer. And as for the interview that is on my laptop, I haven't even dared to share it with my 3 colleagues. So it's there, but it's not there. And that's the experience I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. Again, I'm sure people would like to probe more into these issues and qualms in the Q&A. But next up is Rafael. One of the reasons why we wanted to bring Rafael in on this workshop was that he's been doing some really immersive ethnographic work in a hyper-masculine organization. I'm not sure if how much you'll be focusing on this today, but but anyway, without further ado, on to you, Rafael.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. It's a big pleasure to be sharing my research experience under COVID-19, which is very, very complicated. I love the presentations before. Sorry, I'm not so organized. So the ideas are in my mind because I'm still doing field work. I have been doing field work in the São Paulo police for the last 7 years with goes and backs. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about. So first, ethnography, and I follow them if there is and I'm in a police force which does investigative work. They investigate crimes. So I spent like 6 years in the homicide units, and then the team that was in the homicide unit moved to the kidnap unit. So it was a perfect timing because I have done some field work before in the kidnap unit, but it would be so fantastic because they would be able to explore and to see different things and to explore my research questions over there. And as we all know, ethnography involves a deep personal involvement, right? And it's very extremely embodied, especially in an organization where secrecy is very important, where we have to talk to people face to face. When, for example, I didn't have done many interviews because police officers don't want to sign up consent forms and things like that. So it's a very secretive situation. And then COVID-19 comes up. So the first challenge, I think, is how you keep contact with people. Because if you're doing field work, it's very important to be in touch to people, right? Especially in this type of organization, which is a very secretive organization. But then I will show you two videos just shortly. Let me just share my screen. Second. Can you see my screen now? Yes. Okay. So this is police. We are going to a crime scene before COVID. As you can see here, the driver is not wearing a mask. Of course, there is no COVID. Why would you be wearing a mask, right? And then this one is during COVID, during the worst time of the pandemic in Brazil. So he's using a mask, but the mask is on the mouth. It's not covering his nose, right? Just look at this. Oh, so which was being, let me just stop sharing these. So I was struggling myself in terms of how I will carry out this field work. This is very important. I have been talking to them. We know each other. And when you are immersed in the field, people keep pressure. Come on, you should come. No, I'm not going. Okay, come on. Let you be, sorry for saying this word, let you be a CC. No one, we are police officers. You are amateur research. Come on, you should come here. And no, I can't do it. So when I wrote an article which was published in Gender Work and Organization about masculinity and pandemic, which I had to realize myself that I'm not Indiana Jones, right? It's not because they claim to be heroes, they want to be heroes, and they want to put themselves at risk that I should put myself at risk. No, that's the first part of the story. But then the second part of the story is that I start to phone every day. I phone people every day. We exchange a WhatsApp. So if they go to an operation, they would send me a WhatsApp video of what was going on. Sometimes I would be live talking to them because we have a very good relationship. But then this started to be difficult to do. And there were some very specific situations which I would like to share them. I like to be with them. I like to be talking to them and to be watching what was going on. So what I did is I used a mask. I was the crazy one with the hand sanitizer all the time, but I was putting myself at danger, of course. And then, even when I was with the mask inside the station, they would say, "Oh, professor, take this is useless. This is not. This is for nothing. No, why we're so concerned about this virus?" And then one of the police officers got the virus, and then there was a time when in the unit I'm following, 4 people were with the virus, and they all survived. And they were, come on, you say this virus will take you to the hospital, but it's not nothing major. It's not so, because the way their mentality is to downplay the risks all the time. So what I'm coming up, and which I'm thinking about writing about, is how you manage the risk while you are doing field work. In the type of field work I'm doing, I have to manage the risk all the time. So I have to assess if I can go with the police or if I should not go with the police. I have to assess if it's safe to be in a situation. Not only that, I'm not talking about being with criminals together that they could fire against the police, but also situations where things not very Republican would help in the situation. So you have to be managed all the time. If you stay there, if you don't stay there, in what type of situation you can witness, what type of situation you cannot witness. And then the COVID-19 brought another layer, which is the layer of this how you don't get the virus, right? And how you have to, for example, this week, Brazil now has some variations of COVID. The situation is getting much worse because we have a wonderful president who does all what he has to do to protect the virus, right? It's not to protect the population. And one of my police friends was sending me a message, "Oh, come on, Raf, let's go have a lunch." Oh, lunch is the worst situation, right? Because I have to take off my mask, I have to be in front of each other and those things. And I said, "Oh, I'm going to do that." "Come on, stop." But then they start to swear me, I have to swear back. So there is all this managing thing, which is they're used to have me there. I don't want to leave the fields in a way, but also I have to be careful on how far I go and how dangerous I go and how dangerous I can go because of the virus itself, because they don't care. They're doing what they do, business as usual. They are going out. They don't care about the virus. Actually, in the São Paulo police, I made a comments yesterday about it. Police officers in São Paulo are being killed 4 times more for the virus than in confront with criminals, for example, because they don't care, and the bosses don't care, and nobody cares, right? because they are macho and they are police. So we are in the front line. We have to be responding to the population all the time. In privacy, they will talk to me and say, "Oh, this is so complicated. I'm concerned," especially when the virus, there was the virus outbreak there. "Oh, I'm concerned because I have my mother who's elderly, I have my father and everything." But this managing of the danger, it's something that's they're used to them. I was talking to a police officer from the other police, that's because I'm doing this in the investigative police. There is a patrol police. And he said, "Come on, do you think a virus is gonna kill me, my friends? I have to face dangerous criminals. I'm in São Paulo. I'm working the outskirts of São Paulo. Who cares about this virus?" So there is this sense of building of that's something which from our social class, which I think social class is a big issue here in terms of how you protect yourself and how allowed you are to protect yourself as well. I can stay at home. Today, there was a building there doing some refurbishing the flat above mine. I could come to my brother-in-law. I know, and I mean, that's we have internet and everything. What about the poor people of the global south? What about the people who have to be working every day and then out? The first case in Brazil, the first COVID case in Brazil, there is nobody more racial embodiment than that. The first death in Brazil was a woman who was a maid, and she worked for a rich family who was in Italy and brought the virus to Brazil, and she got the virus and she was killed, right? So this is the type of thing we are talking about when you're talking about unequal. So also sites that are unequal, we know about that. I'm sure that in each country of you, there are poor people who are being unable to protect themselves because they're working in this situation. And in terms of research, I can manage my danger. They cannot then manage the danger. At the end of the day, when you talk to the police officers, they say, "We have to be here, my friend. If we are not, we can face punishment," because leadership is not concerned about it, especially when you have a country like Brazil, where the president don't care. He just don't care. He says lots of very nasty things about it. So I think the question, the key notion, I think, to do field work under COVID is first, you have to find alternative ways of contacting people. So I'm going to the field much less than I used to go. About some time ago, like before the COVID started, I would go once a week, twice a week. Now I'm going maximum once a month, or if not once every 2 months or 3 months. 2 months, I would say. And the second thing is that when you go, how you manage your protection. And the mask is something which is interesting, because one thing that was told that police officers, they would use the hand sanitizer all the time, but they wouldn't put the mask on because the mask shows your fragility. And you cannot be fragile in our environment like that. So when I go, and they were used to me, so I would go out with them and do everything they would do, apart from having a gun and arresting people and these type of things. But then they have a mentality, okay, Raf is one of us, so he's a friend of, he's one of us. Come on. They said to me several times during field work, "How we forget that you were not a police officer and everything." But then as you put the mask on, this becomes clear that you are not one of them. So people start to be concerned about you. People start to be a little bit more suspicious than they were before. And it's build up a hierarchy very strong between you and especially the shop floor police workers, because they are not wearing masks all the time. So there is a question of how you manage your danger, your personal danger. And there is a question of how you manage your field work relationships with people in the field, because they're not as they used to be before. So this is I'm very sorry I didn't theorize a lot, because those are very preliminary impressions that I'm doing while doing field work. So I think they should have a much better theorizing. But I mean, I'm thinking about writing this methodological piece. Maybe in the future, we will see this in print somewhere if they accept me, as they never do. So that's it. Thank you very much. And that was it.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Really excellent. Again, we'll have time to probe more into these issues in the Q&A. Next up, we're going to put you into breakout rooms. But before that, I thought we've all experienced how these digital meetings are taking a toll on us. So before that, we're actually gonna get you to do a little exercise, a little physical exercise. So sure, you don't need to if you don't want to, but those of you who want to get some help getting their blood circulation going, please join me. And the other thing is, also, you do not have to. Feel free to switch off your camera if you feel uncomfortable about this. But anyway, this is what I'm going to do. I suppose this is an exercise which I learned through some of my own embodied and partly immersive field work with a Swedish sportswear company some years ago, where they assume that employees perform better if they're also in better shape. So, you know, they worked physical exercise into almost everything they did. Anyway, during one of the sales conferences, internal sales meetings, and this was the day after Donald Trump was elected president of the USA. Anyway, the whole organization were quite upset by this, especially the marketing director, because, you know, with Trump in the White House, it would be all the more difficult for them to break into the American market. Anyway, this is what he did. He encouraged everyone to stand up. Feel free to join me in this. Raise your hands in the air. Remember, this was November 2016. Yeah, some of you are joining me, very few. Anyway, remember, feel free to switch off your cameras if you don't feel comfortable standing up in front of the camera. Anyway, stand up, raise your hands in the air, look into the sky, stretch out your middle finger, and this is what he said. Fuck you, Mr. Donald Trump. Or you can just, you know, pretend that you're hugging a tree. That also works. Or I don't know, you know, do a little crawl or something. You know. Kirsty Ball, join us. All right. That got my bloodstream going anyway. All right, so this is what we're going to do. Kat has already posted the questions here on the chat. So these are the questions for your breakout rooms. So before COVID, how have you worked or researched with embodied methods before 2020, and how did the census play into that? In other words, no, not in other words. Yeah, anyway. And then during, how does the current situation impact, or how might it impact the embodied elements of your research? What limitations or opportunities does it provide? And then finally, after, is there an after? What trajectories, scars and imprints will COVID have on embodied knowing in research in the future? So if I were to put this into my blunt, simple words, I suppose what I'd ask is, you know, have you done any embodied research during COVID? Secondly, if you, now that we're in this COVID situation, what do you most miss about, you know, the kind of embodied research that perhaps that you did before the Corona crisis? And then I suppose thirdly, you know, what do you most look forward to be able to do when this is all over, or if indeed this is all over? Okay, you'll be allocated automatically, I believe, to into these different breakout rooms, and then we'll see you back here in about 20 minutes. Okay, so bye for now.
Think or less emotional than I am. So I think, you know, I'm being very sort of self-aware and thinking it was me. I made this happen because I'm so I'm also a bit without skin, right? And in situations like these, I get very easily touched. Yeah.
Louise, come to work in my institution that you can be emotional as much as you can here in Brazil. So.
Can I? Can we cry together? Yeah.
All right, great. Okay, yeah, we have several comments on this, and loads of people not agreeing with you that this was a failure, Louise. Anyway, also people questioning the dichotomy between the personal and the professional, and so on. But next, I'd like to reiterate a question from Ozen to everyone. How can we become more aware of our own embodiment during research? Maybe each of our speakers might want to respond to that in turn. Alia.
How can we become more aware of our embodiment? I think for myself, it's just been a process of realizing life is just so embodied that I couldn't, as a researcher, I couldn't do anything but do life in an embodied way. And, you know, even if there's crying involved or there's relating or whatever that may be. And that's why I've become, I'd say, at the very far end of, if we see a spectrum of what Noortje talked about at the beginning, you know, being so removed from the research and being so immersed in the research. And so I choose to be somebody who's very much immersed and who, you know, the relationships are important, and that makes the research richer. And I'm not sure, I'm finding it difficult to answer the question in the way how can we become more aware of embodiment. But for me, when I do my research, I just have to think about everything that's a part of it, the relationships, what I'm wearing, where I'm going. Like every single part of what I do is something that I consider in the research when I'm doing it.
Well, I think I have, for the type of work I do, it's very difficult not to be embodied. But I think the question is, there is a paper, an article from Goffman called On Field Work, in which he says, go and live and do whatever you want and become native and do everything, because that's the best way of doing research. And I have struggled myself with this question of being native or not being native for several times. I think one of the problems I'm facing now is because COVID is showing that I'm not a native. So those are issues that I have to struggle. And I think with the way we teach students and the way we see academia is that we have to be these neutral gods. Even though if we're doing critical research, there is a question I would have to be, and I think I found it very difficult. I remember I become very aware about my embodiment when I'm doing research. I was following a serial killer, a case of a serial killer. You know, he stripped bodies around the cemetery here in São Paulo, and it was in the crime scene. And then I got home, and the police officers, they were, oh, professor, you should be careful. There is this guy here. There is a serial killer, and he's stripping people, so be careful. So he kept like 2 days talking to me like that. And because for a homicide detective, he wants to find a serial killer because that's what he wants to find, right? I mean, that's what because when he finds, he has a lot of challenge, not a normal crime. So there's a lot of issues, identity issues there. And I got home after 4 o'clock in the morning, and I forgot to lock my flats. And then I put my hand and I see, oh my God, I didn't lock my flat. So I put my bulletproof jackets on. I get a knife and I start to search my apartment for the serial killer. And then, I mean, because it was so instinctive and they were talking so much to me. And I was like, oh my God, then I start to laugh my heads off and say, I'm so crazy, come on. So I think you have to be very careful. When you do qualitative research, your feelings, Louise, and I think, you know, they're this better than me. When you feel and you get to feel and you get to be involved on that, when we cry. But I don't know, I'm Brazilian, so this might be why. But I mean, I think that's when you are being professional, my point of view. It's when you are really getting involved on it, when you are being touched by your field, when your research is kind of hijacking you. You know, I think that's more. But this is my impression.
Great, thank you very much, Rafael. We have another question for Yeah, sorry, Louise, did you want to respond as well? We have another question for Alia from Cynthia. Cynthia, would you like to ask your question, please?
Yes, sorry, I was unmuting myself. Yes, thank you to all of you. I was just wondering whether, Alia, you felt more privileged than others to relate to life in multiple countries during your research. And I'm thinking about the lack of opportunities I had to be, or how much my creativity has been affected by being locked down and trapped in my house and in England. And while you had, obviously, you've been working, even if you are now in Zimbabwe, you've also been working in Canada online and stuff like that. So how much does that, you think, different cultures, different place and the ability to move in between has affected your creativity that is so important to your work?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That is actually a very interesting question, because in fact, my creativity comes from having lived in crisis. So really, it's not about a privilege of feeling like I am able to be many things at many times. So in Zimbabwe, for the last over 20 years, we've had a crisis in the country. We had an economic collapse. Basically, nothing works. And so we've had to get really good at figuring things out. We have these like local sayings. I've done research about this, and there are some in other cultures as well. One of them in Shona is kukiakia, and in English we say we just need to make a plan because nothing works. So it's like really creatively overcoming your constraints in ways that are perhaps surprising or you never even imagined you're able to overcome them. And I have some published work about this. So I think my creativity comes very much from that, is very rooted in, this embodiment of crisis. And I mean, it's very funny in the pandemic. Yes, I have had moments where I've had existential crisis, as I mentioned, because, my work just didn't work. As much as I tried to do things, it just didn't go anywhere or it wouldn't happen. I was wondering, what am I contributing to? People are dying, is my work even useful in what's happening? I want to be working on things that are useful. And so all of these kinds of questions just kept leading me to rethink how I do things, and to work through like the general crisis that's happening all the time. Maybe one thing that is a little easier for me is because, as somebody who is attuned to crisis, maybe on some level perhaps I deal with it better, to be able to move in that. But I definitely, my creativity comes a lot from that experience in my life, and having to work from different spaces and navigating different kinds of challenges in all kinds of ways all the time.
Thank you very much, Alia. Great. We also have a question from Siddiq to Rafael. Siddiq, would you like to ask your question, please?
Sure. Hi, Rafael. I really enjoyed your presentation on the police, and I wanted to ask if, given that we might be in a kind of situation where we have to start thinking about virtual or online ethnography or ethnography at a distance, I wonder if we might think about, or I wonder if you've ever thought about the embodied nature of that particular kind of ethnographic work, being comfortable at home while considering uncomfortable topics with the police, or the pain in the hand from holding the phone for too long, or something like that.
Thank you, Siddiq. Very great question. Well, I'm writing, just finished a paper which we are revising now, on the use of WhatsApp while doing research and doing instant messaging systems, which we are using much more now because of this way of contacting. And it's complicated because it turns your life upside down, which means, for example, they are arresting people 4 o'clock in the morning, they wouldn't send me messages. They have done something. There is a question. So they would keep 24 hours, 7 days a week talking to you, and you will be able. And then depends of recording these. There is the question of how you record it and how you analyze everything. It's complicated, and also there is the frustration, the big frustration of being to be watching everything over a phone rather than talking to people. And I think this internet and digital, they have a big comment of addiction. When you are in the field, you are suffering, you are seeing people, you are, I mean, you are engaged with criminals and you're engaged with the police and all their mentality and everything. And while you are doing it online, there is a different type of feeling because you know how it is, but you are not there, so it's more comfortable. So there's a very difficult difference. I mean, there is a very difficult line on how far you go online, how far you go offline, and even if you go online, how far the online research is going to get your life, because you can be all the time. It's different if you have to have a car and get to the, no, you can be just your couch doing everything. So I think this is very, very good question. I think it entails a totally different mode, a different form of embodiment. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Rafael. I think to finish, or before finishing, let's have one more question by Federica. You asked this question to everyone, Federica, but perhaps our three speakers would like to speak to it in turn. Federica, would you like to ask your question? And then I think I'm going to invite Louise first, then Alia, and finally Rafael to reply. So Federica, your question.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for your presentation and sharing your thoughts. Because I don't really do embodied research, but I do video recording. So I do video recorded interaction research in organization, and people are moving, well, now they are in remote working and online. And I was wondering, what are your thoughts about embodied research when we are in a remote home office and we're working remotely? What's the influence, and what is embodied research when we are doing it? We are working online when it comes to study organizations.
Thank you, Federica. Louise, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I don't have any sort of experiences of, on my own, but I have a PhD student, and I just told the people in my group who started out doing her PhD focusing on interviews and observations, and where the embodied aspect is completely central. And with the pandemic, she had to sort of rethink the entire project and do the interviews online, of course. And she's been reflecting about how this is still very embodied in the way that people tend to become more aware about how they actually present themselves when they're being filmed, right? And she feels that this makes it more difficult for her to really get through, because there's always this two screens between them, right? And these two screens, they do sort of encourage us to think about how we look and how we talk, rather than actually thinking mostly on what we're thinking and what we're actually saying. So yeah, shortly. So I hand over.
Thank you, Louise. Alia.
Thanks, Louise. So my thoughts on it. So one of the things I alluded to when I was talking is that I've been reflecting more on like how can I relate, and then what level or way is that relating? So through values, for instance, through my work, and that was encapsulated in the quotes from Bell Hooks of community care and love, and that was guiding all of my actions, especially early on when I was in a leadership position. What is the best decision to make, and how do we make this in the most caring and loving way for everybody and everybody's safety? So that was one of the ways that I thought about embodiment in a virtual sense. Interestingly, the other thing that, and this maybe relates to the other question as well, that somebody who lives across continents, and I'm always moving between them, is that I've had to be in a virtual environment all the time for a lot of my life, to interact with my family, to interact with colleagues. And so I actually don't find it very strange in some ways, because I will, I'll call my nephew in Germany and we'll just hang out, and he's 8, and he'll just chat to me for 2 hours, and I'll be washing the dishes, I'll be cooking, and he's telling me a story about a book he read or doing something silly. And so in that sense, like the digital realm kind of like disappears in those experiences when we're just relating to each other, and we're not in person. And I admit we do lose something from that, but I think that there can be very real experiences if we let go, and we're not, like Louise said, so worried about how we look, or on the screen, and just to live through the screen. And I have a lot of experiences where I do that already, and so I have found it interesting to reflect on that as we've been going through the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Alia. Rafael.
Well, I think it's very important for us to discuss those issues and to be in contact with each other, because that's the most important thing, especially during the pandemic, to be so many faces that we know, to have a supportive community that we can talk about. And also I think sometimes in our university we get so lonely because not a lot of people are doing the type of work we do, and so this type of situation, they can help us a lot. And I think all this situation has changed a lot in the world, but I think we can adapt, and we are adapting. And there is a quote from Walcott, who wrote a book on ethnography, and he says, ethnography is a wonderful excuse for having an adventurous good time while operating under the pretext of doing serious intellectual work. And I think this is the roots, and this is, if we see from what other people are doing in terms of jobs, our friends, we have a fantastic job. We can have a fantastic time in discussing fantastic issues with fantastic people like you all. So I think that's what we have to have in time, to go through those difficult times and to acknowledge how embodied are the things we do. For me, it's easier because, as I say, I'm like, my grandfather is Italian, I'm Brazilian, so emotions are okay, embodiment, those issues are okay. But I think that's not all the same all over the world. So if I could say the last word is, people, keep up and let's have a wonderful time doing research.
Thank you very much, Rafael. That's a splendid way to close. I must say, before handing over to Kat, I really hated the idea of doing an so-called embodied research seminar online, but it's been so wonderful to have our 3 marvelous speakers and to have such a grand, wonderful, terrific audience. Well, not all, but participants. So many terrific questions, so many terrific comments and inputs and everything. So I really hope that we can do something to keep all this going. When we first planned this, we planned something on site in Vancouver, and then COVID arrived, and we had to rethink. But there's no way that we could have gathered so many people together at the same time in one physical location. So so this has really been great. Okay, so Kat, you wanted to conclude.
Yes, thanks so much, Torkild, and thanks everyone. We've overrun slightly, but I thought I hope you found it useful and nourishing and made new friends and new connections. Just before we close, a short reminder about what we'll be doing next in the In Touch series. So we have some upcoming events. We have some publishing critical work events for ephemera next week, and then followed by at the beginning of March for human relations. And then on the 23rd of March, we've got a webinar on the business of immigration or migration. And you can register for all these events at our usual. I've got a foreign body here infecting. I think we can all relate to that. You can register for all our events
at our Eventbrite page. And finally, if you're interested in running a webinar with us, please just get in touch. It's cmswebinar@gmail.com. And as I say, we can have webinars or workshops or any kind of community event that you would like. So just get in touch with us. In the meantime, I'd like to say thank you to Noor, to Louise, to Rafael, to Alia, to Torkild, and thank you everyone for joining us. And take care, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Kat. Bye, everybody.